caused us to sort of want to talk about this is OpenRocket. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. It's a program for designing and simulating model rockets. And in this case, what Upstream delivers is this thing that in the Java world, at least from a distributor standpoint, we call an uber jar or a fat jar. It's a jar file, which is a Java, deliverable that happens to contain other jar files. And what we mean by that is that...
Or other binary artifacts or whatever.
Right. So if they use the equivalent of, 6 other class libraries, which in the C world would be, other shared libraries or libraries of functions, they're actually sort of wrapping all of those up and delivering them so they can give you this one sort of blob that you download. And if you're on a Windows or Mac or Linux machine, you can just run that thing and all of the dependent stuff's there. In the C world, this is the equivalent of shipping a statically linked binary where every library that you depend on, every piece of code you use, every data file is all sort of statically linked into one big binary blob.
And one of the downsides to that is because it's all munched together, we don't know as a distro the provenance of each piece and how it's licensed. If it is licensed, if we have rights to redistribute it, if the parts can be legally combined together and stuff like that. So it ends up making a lot of extra work.
Well, it's just like if you were out on the net and you saw some, executable file. You wouldn't go put that in Debian main, right? It violates the free software guidelines. It's not clearly open source. We don't, know where the source is. We don't have access to it. La 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 la. So, one of the things that we think about some in the context of an application like OpenRocket is, gee, how pedantic do we want to be about this? Do we really care about all those issues? Should we just write a cute little installer thing that downloads their latest mega jar and wraps it with, the thing that gets dropped in user bin that, calls java-jar with the right path and does all that stuff? We could do that. That would be easy from or what versions they were at or any of that sort of, or what licenses they have or any of that sort of stuff. So do you really want to have to do all that work of doing the forensics, of breaking this down, of refactoring their source code and their build scripts in build systems you don't necessarily understand, and if you do understand, you come to dislike passionately very quickly. Do you want to sort of constantly be in the mode of chasing the upstream developers, trying to figure out what they just changed and why it doesn't build anymore, and refactoring their code, and then trying to convince them to take your changes or not? It's a lot of work. The answer is, well, yeah, we are kind of purists, and we really do want to do it that way, but it's really hard.
Well, so that whole process of teasing apart the dependencies can end up being a recursive process where once you find that, oh, there's some jar that's included in your Uber jar, that is itself a mini Uber jar, and that has dependencies somewhere else. And what makes this expensive is, we do this for Debian, others do it for Red Hat, they might do it for Gen 2, and as a community we're spending a lot of our energy repeating the same work.
And the other part of the problem is that we don't tend to notice these things have happened until Upstream makes some new release, and they put out some new jar, and now all of our users are getting tickle reminders from the application, which knows how to go look at the Upstream site and sees that there's a new version and says, hey, don't you want the new version? Can I help you download this Uber jar? And you're sitting there going, oh God, when are we going to find the time to sit down and reverse engineer what they've changed since the last time? And oh wow, there's like 3 new things that aren't packaged in Debian yet. We got to go figure out if that's something that we're allowed to redistribute, and if so, where's the source code, what licenses is it under, and how should we package that? Anyway, you get the idea.
So we're thinking about ways that we can do a better job of collaborating with upstreams. I think that, Monty pointed out that understanding the role of the upstream and the distros is really important, and maybe there's some good lessons that we can take away from that. One of the things that we've got in Debian is we have on the Debian wiki the upstream guide, which is actually a really nice, very comprehensive set of tips and guidelines for upstream maintainers to make that tarball that they produce more friendly for distros to actually take and package in whatever packaging format that they happen to use. I wanted to highlight also, I don't know, is François Marier in the room? François, bonjour. I know Francois. It's kind of interesting. I was working on a completely separate project, and this is one that I was hosting on GitHub, and all of a sudden a pull request came in from Francois. I didn't know Francois at the time, but now I know that he's working for Mozilla on some really cool project, and I realized he was here. And because of that, and I saw his name on the Debian Wiki page, he's got a lot of great blogs about how to, as an upstream, do a better job as an upstream. So I just wanted to call that out. Also, I have a link, and I'll try to publish my slides on my wiki later, so you can actually get some of these links. But there's Spot Callaway from Red Hat has published a nice guide also, and I'm sure a lot of different distributions have guides on how to be a good upstream. And I think that, you know, thinking about how we can do that socially and technically is really important. And speaking about the technical part of that, I wanted to highlight for you, if you're not aware of it, some interesting research that's been going on, particularly at the University of Paris and at INRIA in France, on some work to share metadata information. If you think of a distribution as a repository that has a set of packages, where each package has a name and a version, and what users want to do is they either want to install a set of packages or upgrade them or remove them. And they might have some preferences about, do they want to be bleeding edge or do they want to be super stable? This is collectively what is known as the upgrade problem. And this research group called Mancusi, or Managing the Complexity of Open Source Software, actually has done a really great job of looking at this upgrade problem and breaking apart the dependency solving part of it from the UI. The reason that this is interesting is we just rattled off all these different language environments, in fact all the different distro package managers that resolve the dependency problem. And the research that I'll give you pointers to highlights the fact that if you can make that a pluggable API between the solving of the dependencies, which is very complex, and the UI for the particular environment, you can actually test and debug and evolve the dependency solvers and end up with much higher quality ones that do a better job of meeting the constraints that you've requested, and also do it in as much as 1/100th of the time. This is called, the format for this API is called the Common Upgrade Description Format, or a CUDF. And it's a very simple text-based format. It's actually sort of a subset of what you'd see in Debian control files. All I want to do is mention that this is already in use, for example, in the Eclipse IDE for their plugin manager to resolve dependencies. We talked about language dependency solvers. OCaml's package manager, OPAM, uses this infrastructure. Debian has a package called apt-cudf, which allows you to use pluggable solvers within APT. So the point is that maybe we can use an API like CUDF as a way to express metadata perhaps between each of our distributions, and maybe even between upstreams and distributions. And you know, the question is, maybe can we formulate in this machine readable way, you know, what it is that as distros we care about from upstreams, and could we ask upstreams to include metadata in their tarballs so that they can help all the distros solve this problem together instead of duplicating the effort every time.
Yeah, and to be absolutely clear, you know, I mentioned OpenRocket. It's not that the upstream developers are bad people. In fact, quite the contrary. They are awesome folks. I love interacting with them. They have a very active mailing list. There's an IRC channel. There's usually somebody there every time we're stumbling with something. And I have this strong suspicion that if we were very clear and concise about what it is that we needed them to do as they were grabbing new code and dropping it into their source repositories to capture sort of the minimum required set of metadata, so that this reverse engineering of what they had done that we now needed to figure out and, you know, refactor to package things appropriately in our distro. If we were good at articulating that, I suspect they'd be happy to do it. But we really sort of haven't asked them this question yet, because we keep sort of struggling back and forth about exactly what's the right way to do this, and can we figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't just help our immediate problem, but maybe is more useful across distribution boundaries. So I'm curious, of the folks that are in the room, how many of you actively package things for one or another Linux distribution? That's a fair number of people. Which distributions? Just yell them out. What do you?
Debian.
Yes! Okay, so yeah, it is the universal operating system. It's the solution to all your problems. Anything other than Debian?
Gentoo PPAs.
Gentoo, Fedora.
Gentoo, Fedora, PPAs, yeah.
Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, Red Hat, Sunday.
Yeah, you're sick, man. Okay, so you know the answer and you can just tell it to us all because you do it for everybody, right?
It's a pain.
It's pain, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, some guys do it really well. I mean, occasionally you get a tarball down, there's some guys out there that do really good jobs that put all the Debian config files in a way that work intelligently for Ubuntu. We've got spec files for multiple distributions. You know, I've worked inside a corporation where if we were touching anything from a third party that wasn't coming officially from a distro, we had to rebuild, repackage, validate, GPG sign, and so on before we could provide it to any of our downstream customers that we were supporting, and deal with all the dependency issues, and then track, in some cases, all those security alerts around all the various subcomponents that we were again having to make available to our customers.
Well, I think Monty made a really interesting point in his talk about, is it time to rethink sort of what the role of a distribution is and maybe have a distribution focus on a very much smaller problem. I find that every time I'm forced to deal with some Linux distribution other than Debian, the immediate strongly negative reaction that I have is, oh my God, they're forcing me to have to go to more than one place to find the things I need to do to solve my challenge. And, I guess I'm just spoiled, but when you live in Debian space, if you need, GPG, you just apt-get install it. And, if the package exists at all, it's assumed to comply with the policies, the current policy documents and all that sort of thing. And anything you find that's wrong, you know where to go to file a bug about it, and that somebody will eventually get around to looking at it. Yeah, you just sort of assume that if you report a bug, eventually somebody will look at it, unless, of course, it's Vito who maintains it. Yeah, that there's just sort of this wonderful sort of set of expectations. When you have a distro that has, what is it now, 27,000 and some packages, the chances are very high at any given moment that something you think of that you'd like to work on, somebody else has already packaged the bits, and you don't really have to do a lot of work, except that, those of us who actually are the ones who make all of that work do actually have to do all that work. So, I don't know, do any of you have thoughts, other thoughts about,
I was actually going to take the opposite position. As a Debian packager and as an upstream for other things, my preference is to keep the packaging completely separate. So an editor that I work with, I've had lots of discussions with Tom, who's upstream, and it's like, well, no, actually, don't put my packaging in your repository because we're always one revision out of sync. Any changes I make go back to him to be patched into the next revision, and I've still got a diff because if nothing else, I've got the changelog entry. But it's typically more than that as well, and so...
Yeah, I've certainly played on both sides of that debate as well. I actually went through all of the complex gymnastics to do copyright assignment to the FSF as an employee of HP when I still was, so that the contents of the Debian directory for GNU Radio could get merged upstream so that they could do builds for various Ubuntu versions, things I didn't care about.
Actually okay.
Yes, the consequence of that is I became a GNU Radio upstream committer, and all I've ever touched is the contents of the Debian directory. But the problem is, even then, I wasn't actually using the upstream repo as the place that was my canonical sort of source of bits for doing my builds, and so there was always that sort of dichotomy thing going on. On one hand, it was really cool that upstream cared about at least one distribution that used the same packaging format that I did, so they were mostly inclined to keep those builds working. But actually, it's another thing that Tom and I've had some very recent...
Hold that thought for just a second, because you didn't really come back to the thing that Monty had sort of suggested, that maybe distros need to lose some weight and just provide C compilers. And here's the problem, or the fear that I have, is that when upstreams have sufficiently complex products that need you know, maybe they need some authentication layer, maybe they need some database layer, maybe they have some application server, maybe they have blah, blah, blah. And oh, the most easy way to handle that or to distribute that is as a virtual image. I will give you a VirtualBox image, I will give you an OpenStack image, I'll give you something else. And if that's all you ever wanted to do, that's awesome. But I find a lot of times, you know, and I'm sure that you do too, that you want to take upstream A, and you want to combine it with upstream B, and you want to make your own glue, and maybe some other upstream D, and they all have to live within the same space. You don't actually want to, you know, do, you know, TCP/IP to communicate between all of these different environments. That's why I think having the rich distro is still really, really useful. What do you think?
Well, yeah, and we've certainly seen cases where upstreams or, you know, projects, OpenStack's a great example, where there's a lot of complexity. It could certainly be reasonable to think in terms of creating an installer image that has some kind of lightly derived version of a particular distro so that you have, you know, one deliverable product. And maybe it's important to you to be able to test everything in sort of a working live environment like that or something. I don't know. But on the flip side, I find that every time I end up in a situation where I've got more than one sources of the stuff that I depend on that I'm having to install things from, and I have more than one path through which I might have to report bugs or defects or enhancement requests or whatever, I'm sort of, you know, allowing complexity back in my life that I've managed to elide by, you know, choosing to live in the world of something like a Debian distribution. So, you know, on some philosophical, intellectual level, I can sort of hear this argument and go, yeah, I can see why it might be really nice in some context for us to somehow, you know, pull back in and not try to encompass the entire world. And then my hindbrain immediately kicks in and goes, you fool, don't ever let yourself be dragged back down into that space. Yeah.
One way I think that we could address this is to get upstream to both have infrastructure and developers that are interested in maintaining old versions, which are currently in stable distros. Any words to help encourage that?
I think that's actually a great lead into the continuous integration stuff we've been playing with.
Well, you know, part of the thought, and this is really, you know, we were just brainstorming about ways that we could have distros and upstreams collaborate better, and it seems like there's got to be an opportunity around continuous integration to check. I mean, a lot of, you know, what Monty was saying, you know, in that case where you would do a commit and actually try to build packages from it, I would think it has some advantages to flesh out complex dependency graph issues early. Is it? Yeah, it's really expensive, but machine time is cheap.
So after Tom showed up at this rocket launch last year and kind of got enthusiastic, he and his boys all got enthusiastic about, you know, playing rocketry games with us, and we started trying to rope Tom into helping us deal with software. We of course went, oh, you know, Tom, he's got like Java next to his name somehow. He must want to help us work on the Android app for our new cool toys, right? Haven't managed to suck him into that yet. But what he sort of volunteered to do that I think Keith and I initially went, yeah, okay, fine, whatever, it doesn't seem important, but if he wants to do it, that's great, was he put up a Jenkins instance and set it up so every time we do a you know, push commit into our you know, sort of publicly visible Git repo, it tries to build the code. And oh my God, that's been the most wonderful thing that's ever happened, because now Keith actually has a tight feedback loop every time he breaks something. Jenkins tells him.
He gets a nasty gram.
It used to be. It used to be that, you know, we'd go along developing and we'd be talking over IRC and we'd be coming up with new ideas and new features and making things work and testing stuff, and we go back and forth for a very long time, and we go to do a release. And part of the release process is I was actually trying to build, you know, objects that we'd be willing to hand to, you know, paying customers. And I'd stumble over all the stuff that he just sort of installed in his build environment over time as he was making things work, and I had to reverse engineer all these build dependencies and stuff. And I have to admit that the fact that now, you know, we have this sort of independent sitting over on the side build environment that Tom's running causes us to very quickly know when, oops, you know, that doesn't build anymore. And oh, it's because now we need to have such and such, you know, new thing installed in the build environment.
Another Java library.
Yeah, another Java library. And so, you know, there's still, you know, the one challenge is that the way it gets fixed right now is Tom goes and installs that particular thing.
No. The way that this happens is Jenkins sends Keith a nastygram.
Yes.
Keith gets on IRC and he says, Tom, would you please install package foo? And then I go and install package foo, and then I poke Jenkins to retry, and then Jenkins says, awesome, we're happy.
And then Bido goes, yeah, but you didn't actually capture that in the Debian control file, so I'm stuck. So please, could we get Jenkins using something like git build package instead of doing this with just the source checkout and a... Anyway, we'll get there. But,
that's the next step.
It's really been very interesting to see, if we sort of think of Keith as being the primary upstream author of the software for the Rocketry stuff, which is absolutely literally true. And you know, Tom and I are acting as sort of the people trying to, you know, be the distributors and package it and all. We have discovered that having this sort of mutual sort of interface through a Jenkins instance is really helpful. And I think, you know, in your world, Manu, the notion of, regardless of whether it's PPA-ish stuff or, you know, auto building things that you're doing in your infrastructure, there certainly seems to me to be some kind of middle ground between, you know, this is only an upstream thing, this is only a distro thing, where the point of collaboration could become, you know, how do we most successfully capture the information, the metadata that's required to make auto builders capable of continuously building things as we go along. And just figuring out the right way to do that so it's not tied to a particular distro at a particular release level so much, but is, you know, capturing better metadata is probably a good way to do it.
There's a thing called Scope, which has been around for a while. There's some tooling that's been built up over time, and that is a description of a project. It's a language for describing projects, dependencies.
I haven't run into that at all. Huh, dope. Like DOAP or?
DOAP.
Okay, cool. See.
Coming back to this idea of this metadata that we have, this description that we use upstream and the distribution, really has got to be shared bidirectionally. You know, we need that the common well-defined distribution releases, for example, particularly with the arrival of things like LTS releases and enterprise distributions, where we want some long-term stability, that there's a well-defined list of what those components are for upstream to develop against, validate against. Because there's nothing worse than all of a sudden there's a new LTS has been out for 9 months of a given release, and the new food doesn't work on it anymore because we've already moved that much further ahead.
Right. So just a second. It makes me think that what we could do is robotically extract the repository metadata from the distro and publish that in a raw format. Actually, I know that as part of the EDOS project, there's this site called Debian Weather that basically does this and checks to see if all the packages are installable at any given time, and if they're not, then you get, you know, then the weather turns rainy, and if it's really broken, then it's thunderstorms and black, and it's all bad.
Yeah, you know, other folks have done things like try to automatically rebuild all the source packages in the archive and things like that, and you know, it's a good excuse to warm up your cluster once in a while. So you had a.
One problem I've had in the Samba project, we've just released Samba 4, and at the moment there aren't any good packages for Samba 4.0 of everything. So I'm going to talk about sysadmin. We end up trying to tell our users what things they have to install, and the OS requirements page has become this for Debian, this for Ubuntu, most of this same, this for Fedora, this for Dell, this for, and the list is getting endlessly long. And of course, if I change something, I've got to go and try and sort of put the right things in there, remove the things that, because it's a wiki page that users have put up here,
yeah, of course,
they might have needed or thought they needed just gets put in the line. And it's a real problem for us because trying to even maintain that for about 10 different operating systems, it's insane, but otherwise our users fail over basic requirements and can't build their DC. So it's a real issue for us as an upstream as well as getting it to the packages.
So this is why I go back to this notion I commented on a few minutes ago, that I have a strong suspicion that most upstreams would happily do the little bit of extra overhead required to be helpful if we were just good in a cross-distro. If I go to them and say, I'm a Debian guy, and in order to do this right in Debian, you need to do the following things for me, their answer is going to be, oh, God, now I'm going to have 12 other distros telling me what they need too. I suspect we went to them and said, hey, look, there's this well-understood boundary condition problem between, what you as an upstream want to work on and what distributors and packagers of your software would like to work on. Here's our cookbook for you. Here's our recipe guide for you. Do these things in this kind of way, have this kind of a file somewhere in your source distribution that captures these little bits of metadata for us. I bet you most upstreams would actually be willing to do that. My experience is a lot of the craziness that we have to deal with as distribution package maintainers, where we talk about, insane upstreams and stuff like that, is that they just haven't ever thought about the issues. They haven't stumbled over it. Nobody's tried to ask them why they didn't do something a certain way. It's certainly been the case that every time I've run into some crazy ass license, just asking the upstream, would you consider picking one of the ones that's on the OSI approved list that is also, considered DFSG compliant, almost always the answer is, oh yeah, it never occurred to me that anybody would actually care about my code enough for this to matter. And in general, I think it's true that people want to do the right things, and if they have some idea what the right thing to do is, they're willing to do it. So I'm sure there'll always be an upstream somewhere that wants to just lob rotten fruit at us. But yeah,
if you work out a common descriptor format, and then you expect the upstreams to maintain it when they're not using it for their own builds, I think that's problematic.
I don't know that I would expect them to maintain all of it, but if they understood the value of that metadata,
and I'm thinking along the lines of, if we had a new build tool that was attractive because it made your life easier, that would mean that that's an
NP complete problem. Sorry.
Yeah. The other thing is there are packaging formats already that have got this metadata in that we could extract. So we could take what's in a Perl module's specification of its dependencies and map that to our dependencies.
Well, we have the part right now. We have, and actually I just sent some message to some people based on the thing you had up there a second ago. But like OpenStack, we can list our Python dependencies, but I can't tell you that you've also got to install MySQL and libvirt, because those are Debian packages or Fedora packages or whatever. And how do I express that in my Python project? I don't know.
Well, it's a
README file right now, and that doesn't.
We all understand there's another element of complexity in that not only do distributions not always pick the same name for packages, but one of the things that differentiates different Linux distributions is the granularity at which they package things. And in Debian, that was a very conscious set of decisions a long time ago, that going with a finer granularity actually sort of makes lots of things work better. But it does sometimes make it harder if you're trying to manage this kind of information, because it does mean that sometimes the names get more complicated. It's not just blah. It's you need blah 3 something or other, whatever.
So we've got about 3 minutes left. There's a question back here, and then there's Joey.
I was going to say, in practice, this problem's also not as bad as it might be in theory, in that upstreams for a long time have just had a README file that says, you'll also need these other things at least this version. And sure, that's not machine readable, but it's there, and it's actually not that big a deal to translate that into your local when you're the maintainer. And also, this work doesn't get redone for all the different distros, because the maintainer, if they're aware of it, if you're thinking about it, will go look at how the Red Hat guys package it, how the whatever guys package it, and you'll swap patches and you'll swap in and you'll see, oh, they have to do that patch in order to change the install directory.
Even better, the distro can tell the upstream, this is what you need to put in that section for us.
I will admit the thing that really...
Our packages and our versions.
Yeah, the thing that really started pushing my buttons on this was starting to deal with, Java developers' Uber jars, and the fact that now all of a sudden, here's a language environment that I'm not personally terribly skilled at. I understand why it's the right thing for us to be doing our Rocketry ground station software, because we have Windows and Mac users as customers, and we really can do a single source tree and build installers on Debian for all of those environments, and they work. But when you have upstreams who have never even thought about the fact that there might be a problem with incorporating all of this stuff, they actually think it's a huge benefit, because now the Windows folks just...
Now that you have done that,
yeah.
Red Hat packager of it can gain from that.
Yeah.
If you find a Debian package,
I just wish somebody at Red Hat would package OpenRocket so I could borrow their.
Right, that's right. So what
Sorry,
happens
sorry,
when you
sorry.
first go to the packager?
Yeah, some of this is first packager syndrome. You're absolutely right. Joey.
Trying to pull some of this together, it seems to me that one way you could bootstrap something like this is if you had a tool that users could use that would, say, solve the problem that Samba has that I also have of installing the dependencies so they can actually build your software. They have the tarball. If there was a tool and it just said, okay, you know, I need these things, and I had to go up to the distribution to get the actual package mapping, you know, that's split up in Debian and so on. So there'd be a source of data in the distribution, a source of data in the tarballs of whatever projects feel like participating in this, and then a tool that users actually use, so they're actually driving the upstream projects and the distribution.
So sort of like a step before AutoConf that would go get the build depends?
Yeah, so just something to get the dependencies, skip the building because that's a hard problem, and it's easy to say type
Map a canonical name to a...
Yeah, exactly. You have to have it in the distribution and in the upstream project.
What about package conf? .bc files go somewhere towards them, don't they?
But they're not, they're all platforms.
So don't-
Haskell,
Don't get me started yelling about package conf too. That's a whole other kind of
So you
real
could potentially have configure talk to an upstream like the, because you go looking for a library, it doesn't find the library, it can actually feed back and say you need to install the lib foo package on Debian, and on Red Hat it might say something different.
So we're kind of running out of time. I want to sort of thank all of you for being here. I think we've done what we hope to do, which is we've got folks thinking about some of these issues, some as evidenced by the fact that a bunch of you are jumping in and starting to think about, you know, how might we solve this problem. So I feel really good about the effort that I convinced Tom to make to actually put this, because I just showed up. But so thanks, Tom. It's Tom's first time at LCA. He's got another talk later. Tomorrow, actually, yeah. So, and that's on
Closure.
On Closure, yes. A very interesting topic in and of itself.
And before we let everybody go, I want to send out a special thanks to Stefano Zaccaroli, who is the current Debian project leader, because he gave me a lot of good ideas and pointers on CUDF and this whole dependency problem. And what I'll do is I'll publish these slides that you didn't see and these other links. Probably the easiest way to communicate that to you is follow my address on Twitter or Identica @tmarble, and I'll microblog pointers there.
Okay, great. Any last things before we wrap up? Excellent, cool. Thank you so much for your time and attention.